The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Bulldog Rodriguez pressed his headset tighter against his ear, straining to make sense of the transmission coming from Bagram Airfield. The words that filtered through the white noise would haunt him for the rest of his career. Bravo team, your extraction point has been compromised. Repeat, LZ Charlie is hot. You have 15 Taliban fighters moving up the eastern ridge and your pilot. The transmission cut to silence. In the belly of the MH-60M Black Hawk helicopter, 6 Navy SEALs sat in the red-lit darkness, their faces painted with the grim concentration of men who knew they were flying into hell. Rodriguez looked across the cabin at his team, Thompson cleaning his M4 carbine for the third time, Jenkins adjusting his night vision goggles, Kowalski methodically checking his medical kit. These were the best operators the Navy had produced, warriors who had survived 3 deployments and countless firefights. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the mountain itself seemed to be conspiring against them. The helicopter's twin engines thrummed with mechanical precision as they carved through the thin mountain air at 8,000 feet. Outside the small porthole windows, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, jagged peaks silhouetted against a moonless sky, valleys that had swallowed armies for centuries. Rodriguez had studied the topographical maps until his eyes burned, memorizing every elevation line, every potential landing zone, every escape route. But maps, he was beginning to realize, couldn't capture the malevolent spirit of these ancient mountains. "Sir," came a voice from the cockpit, transmitted through the intercom system. The pilot's voice was steady, professional, but Rodriguez detected something underneath, a tension that made his stomach tight. "We're approaching the target area. Weather's deteriorating faster than forecast. Visibility dropping to near zero." Rodriguez unstrapped himself and moved toward the cockpit, his boots finding purchase on the vibrating metal floor. Through the reinforced glass, he could see nothing but impenetrable darkness punctuated by occasional flashes of lightning. The storm had come from nowhere, a meteorological ambush that threatened to turn their precision operation into a death trap. What Rodriguez couldn't see from his position was the pilot's hands on the controls, hands that belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Raven Blackwater, a Lakota woman whose grandmother had taught her to read the sky like ancient scripture. Those hands, scarred from years of maintenance work and steady from countless combat hours, were about to become the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But first, she had to prove herself to men who saw only her gender and her unconventional path to the cockpit. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier with an intelligence briefing that should have been routine. Taliban Commander Khalil Hakim, responsible for 3 IED attacks that had killed 14 American soldiers, had been located in a remote compound nestled in the Korangal Valley. The plan was surgical. Insert Bravo team at LZ Charlie, a narrow ridge 2 clicks from the target, conduct a rapid strike, extract the HVT, and return to base before dawn. Simple, clean, by the book. Rodriguez had run similar operations dozens of times, relying on meticulous planning and overwhelming firepower. But the mountains of Afghanistan had a way of making even the best plans irrelevant. Chief Blackwater had been assigned to the mission at the last minute when the original pilot, Captain Davis, had come down with food poisoning. Rodriguez remembered the briefing room falling silent when she walked in, her flight suit immaculate, her black hair pulled back in regulation style, her dark eyes scanning the tactical displays with the intensity of a predator studying prey. The silence hadn't been respectful, it had been skeptical. A few of the SEALs had exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that said more than any spoken doubt. She had 400 combat flight hours, 3 Bronze Stars, and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home against impossible odds. But she was still the unknown variable in an equation that demanded perfection. The helicopter lurched suddenly, caught in a downdraft that sent Rodriguez stumbling against the bulkhead. Outside, the storm was intensifying, turning the mountain passes into a maze of wind shear and zero visibility. Most pilots would have turned back, called for a weather delay, waited for better conditions. But Blackwater's voice came through the intercom with the calm authority of someone who had danced with death before. "Bravo team, we're going to thread the needle. Hold on tight." She banked the aircraft 30 degrees to port, following a route that existed only in her mind, a path between the peaks that the maps couldn't show, that GPS coordinates couldn't capture. Her hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of a musician playing a complex symphony, each adjustment calculated not just from her instruments, but from an intuitive understanding of how the mountain winds behaved, how the ridgelines channeled the storm's fury. This wasn't just flying. It was a conversation with the sky itself, conducted in a language older than modern warfare. In the cabin, Thompson looked up from his weapon, his usual bravado replaced by something approaching awe. He had flown with dozens of pilots, from cocky aviators fresh out of flight school to grizzled veterans with more combat hours than some soldiers had training hours. But he had never experienced flying like this, a seamless blend of technology and instinct that made the helicopter feel less like a machine and more like a living thing responding to its pilot's will. The aircraft moved through the storm with an almost supernatural grace, finding pockets of stable air that shouldn't have existed, avoiding downdrafts that would have sent lesser pilots into the mountainside. Rodriguez made his way back to the cockpit, needing to see what was happening. Through the windscreen, he watched Blackwater navigate by instruments alone, her eyes moving between the altimeter, the artificial horizon, and the terrain-following radar with the rapid precision of a computer processing data. But there was something more, a stillness about her that suggested she was listening to sounds the instruments couldn't detect, feeling vibrations that the gauges couldn't measure. She was reading the mountain like her ancestors had read the Great Plains, finding the safe path through intuition honed by generations of survival. The first sign of trouble came at 4:21 hours when the radio burst to life with panicked voices from the ground. "Bravo team, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on your LZ. Taliban forces have moved faster than anticipated. Count 12 fighters on the ridge, possibly more in the tree line. LZ Charlie is no longer viable. Repeat, LZ Charlie is compromised." Rodriguez felt his jaw clench. The mission was unraveling before they even reached the target area. Without a secure landing zone, they couldn't insert the team. Without the team on the ground, Khalil Hakim would disappear into the mountain wilderness, probably forever. Blackwater's response came immediately, her voice cutting through the static with the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in milliseconds. "Overwatch, this is Raven. What's the visibility on LZ Bravo?" There was a pause then. "Raven, LZ Bravo is socked in. Cloud ceiling at 50 feet, winds gusting to 40 knots. No pilot in their right mind would attempt a landing in those conditions." Another pause, longer this time. When Blackwater spoke again, there was something in her voice that made Rodriguez's pulse quicken, not fear, but the cold certainty of someone who had found their moment of truth. "Overwatch, Raven. I'm not in my right mind. I'm exactly where I need to be." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the mountain gods themselves. Rodriguez found himself studying Blackwater's profile in the green glow of the instrument panel, nodding the way her jaw was set, the slight forward lean of her shoulders that suggested a predator preparing to strike. This was the moment when ordinary pilots turned back, when reasonable people chose to live another day. But Chief Warrant Officer Raven Blackwater had not survived 3 combat deployments and earned her reputation by being reasonable. She banked the helicopter into a descent that defied logic, dropping toward the cloud-shrouded peaks at a rate that made Rodriguez's stomach lurch. The altimeter spun downward, 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. Outside the windows, the world had disappeared into a gray void of cloud and precipitation. They were flying blind now, trusting their lives to instruments and to the steady hands of a pilot who seemed to have made peace with mortality long before this night. LZ Bravo in 30 seconds, Blackwater announced, her voice steady despite the fact that they were descending toward a landing zone she couldn't see, in weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. Bravo team, prepare for immediate insertion. This is going to be fast and it's going to be rough. Rodriguez keyed his radio to alert his team, but before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a narrow strip of rocky ground, illuminated by the helicopter's powerful searchlight like a stage waiting for its actors. Wasn't luck. Rodriguez realized that with the sudden clarity of revelation. Blackwater had been counting seconds, calculating wind drift, using some internal compass that guided her to this exact spot at this exact moment. She had found a landing zone that existed for perhaps 90 seconds before the clouds would close again, and she had found it without being able to see it. The helicopter touched down with barely a shudder, its skids finding solid purchase on ground that shouldn't have been there. "Go, go, go," Rodriguez shouted, and his team poured out of the aircraft like water from a broken dam. 6 shadows disappearing into the Afghan night, swallowed by darkness and purpose. The entire insertion had taken less than 40 seconds, a masterpiece of precision flying that would be talked about in flight schools for years to come. But as Rodriguez's boots hit the rocky ground, he realized that the hard part was just beginning. The mission itself unfolded with the brutal efficiency that had made Navy SEALs legendary. Moving through the darkness with night vision goggles and suppressed weapons, Bravo team swept through the compound like ghosts made manifest. Khalil Hakim was taken alive, zip-tied and hooded before he fully understood what was happening. The entire assault lasted 11 minutes, a testament to months of planning and years of training. But as Rodriguez checked his watch and calculated their timeline, he realized they had a problem that no amount of training could solve. The weather was getting worse. The storm that had been brewing during their approach had intensified into something biblical. Winds howled through the mountain passes at 60 knots, turning the air into a liquid medium that seemed to resist the very concept of flight. Snow mixed with sleet created visibility conditions that would ground aircraft at major airports, let alone on a mountainside landing zone 8,000 feet above sea level. As Rodriguez crouched behind a boulder, listening to the wind scream like a living thing, he began to understand that getting to the target had been the easy part. "Raven, this is Bravo team. Package secured, ready for extraction." Rodriguez's voice barely carried over the sound of the storm. The response came back immediately, Blackwater's voice as steady as if she were commenting on the weather at a Sunday picnic. "Bravo team, Raven, I see you on thermal. Extraction in 2 minutes. Be ready to move fast, this window won't stay open long." Rodriguez looked around at his team, seeing his own doubts reflected in their faces. The helicopter's rotors were invisible in the driving snow, its engines barely audible over the howling wind. Landing in these conditions wasn't just dangerous, it was borderline suicidal. But 2 minutes later, like an apparition materializing from the storm itself, the Black Hawk appeared. Its searchlight cut through the precipitation like a sword of white fire, illuminating the landing zone with almost supernatural precision. Blackwater brought the aircraft down in a descent that seemed to defy the laws of physics, her rotor wash clearing the snow just enough to create a pocket of relative calm in the center of the maelstrom. The skids touched the rocky ground, with the gentleness of a mother tucking a child into bed. "Move, move, move." Rodriguez grabbed Khalil Hakim by his flex scuffs and half-carried, half-dragged the prisoner toward the aircraft. His team followed, their movements efficient despite the wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. The extraction took 38 seconds during which Blackwater held the helicopter in a hover that required every ounce of her skill and strength. The stick fought her like a living thing, the pedals demanding constant adjustment as the mountain winds tried to slam the aircraft into the rocky ground. As the last SEAL dove through the cabin door, Blackwater pulled collective and twisted throttle with movements so smooth they looked choreographed. The Black Hawk rose from the landing zone like smoke, climbing into the storm with a confidence that seemed to mock the very concept of impossibility. Rodriguez strapped himself into his seat and tried to process what he had just witnessed. He had seen exceptional pilots before, aviators who could make their aircraft dance. But this was different. This was artistry. The flight back to Bagram should have been routine. The hard part was over, the mission accomplished, the prisoner secured. But the Hindu Kush Mountains had one more lesson to teach, one final test of the woman who had dared to challenge their authority. At 5:47 hours, 37 minutes into their return flight, Blackwater's voice came through the intercom with a calmness that made Rodriguez's blood run cold. "Bravo team, we have a problem. Engine failure on number 2. We're going to emergency power." The helicopter lurched as one of its twin turbine engines died. Its mechanical death rattled barely audible over the sound of the surviving engine struggling to carry the full load. They were still over hostile territory, still surrounded by peaks that rose above their current altitude, still fighting weather that would challenge a healthy aircraft. With only one engine, they had minutes to find a place to land before the remaining turbine overheated and died, turning their aircraft into a 10,000-pound projectile aimed at the unforgiving mountainside. Rodriguez unstrapped himself and moved to the cockpit, needing to see what options they had. Through the windscreen, the terrain looked like the surface of an alien planet, nothing but jagged ridges and vertical drops, no flat ground visible anywhere. The GPS showed their position with electronic precision, but geography didn't lie. They were in the heart of one of the most forbidding mountain ranges on Earth, flying a crippled aircraft in weather that grounded commercial aviation. This was how helicopters and their crews disappeared, becoming statistics in accident reports and names on memorial walls. But Blackwater's hands remained steady on the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire career. She had practiced single-engine approaches until they became muscle memory, had studied emergency procedures until she could recite them in her sleep. But practice was different from the real thing, especially when the real thing involved a mountainside landing in a blizzard with 6 Navy SEALs and a high-value prisoner depending on her skills for their survival. "There," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through Rodriguez's dark thoughts. "Ridge line at 2 o'clock, approximately 8 clicks, flat enough for an auto-rotation if we can reach it." Rodriguez followed her gaze and saw nothing but swirling snow and darkness. But Blackwater had already begun her approach, the helicopter descending in a controlled glide that balanced altitude against airspeed in an equation that had only one correct answer. Too steep and they would fall like a stone, too shallow and they would never reach their improvised landing zone. The auto-rotation began at 4,000 feet above the ridgeline, Blackwater lowering collective to enter the emergency maneuver that would trade altitude for rotor RPM. Without engine power, the helicopter became a controlled falling leaf, its rotors spinning from the relative wind created by their descent. It was a technique that required perfect timing. Too early, and they would run out of altitude short of their target. Too late, and they would hit the ground with the force of a meteor. Rodriguez found himself holding his breath, watching the altimeter unwind like a clock counting down to doomsday. At 200 feet above the ridge, Blackwater began her flare, pulling back on the cyclic to trade their forward airspeed for a reduction in descent rate. The helicopter's nose rose dramatically, its belly presented to the mountain like an offering to the gods of aviation. This was the moment of truth, when physics and pilot skill would determine whether they walked away or became another cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms. The rotor RPM was decaying now, the stored energy in the spinning blades their only protection against gravity's final verdict. Skids touched the rocky ground with a jar that rattled Rodriguez's teeth, but they were down, alive. The rotors wound down to silence, leaving only the sound of wind howling across the desolate ridgeline. For a moment nobody moved. They sat in the sudden quiet, processing the fact that they had survived what should have been unsurvivable. Then Blackwater's voice came through the intercom one final time, matter of fact as if she had just completed a routine training flight. "Bravo team, welcome to scenic nowhere. We'll be camping here until the weather clears and maintenance arrives." Rodriguez looked at his watch. 6:23 hours. In just over 2 hours, they had inserted into hostile territory, completed their mission, extracted under impossible conditions, and survived an emergency landing that most pilots would have considered beyond their abilities. All because of a Lakota woman whose steady hands had refused to acknowledge defeat. As he unbuckled his harness and prepared to secure the landing zone, Rodriguez realized he was looking at Blackwater with new eyes, not as the last-minute replacement pilot who happened to be female, but as the aviator who had just saved all their lives. The rescue took 14 hours. 14 hours of huddling in the disabled aircraft while the storm raged around them, sharing MREs and taking turns standing watch for Taliban fighters who might have seen their emergency landing. 14 hours during which Rodriguez watched Blackwater work methodically through her emergency checklist, documenting the engine failure, calculating fuel consumption, and monitoring weather reports on her backup radio. She showed no sign of stress, no indication that crash landing a helicopter in enemy territory was anything more than a minor inconvenience in her day. When the rescue helicopter finally appeared through the clearing clouds, Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and something else, a reluctance to leave this windswept ridge where he had witnessed something extraordinary. The crew chief who rappelled down from the hovering aircraft took one look at their emergency landing site and shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am," he said to Blackwater, "I don't know how you put this bird down in one piece. Most pilots would have punched out and taken their chances with the mountain." Blackwater just smiled and began gathering her flight gear, as if miraculous flying was simply part of her job description. The debriefing at Bagram Airfield lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about Khalil Hakim's capture. Maintenance crews needed to understand the engine failure, and flight safety investigators required a complete reconstruction of the emergency landing. Rodriguez sat through it all, watching Blackwater answer questions with the same professional competence she had displayed in the cockpit. But he noticed something else, the way the room's atmosphere had changed. The skeptical glances were gone, replaced by the respectful attention given to someone who had proven themselves under fire. Later in the officers' club, Rodriguez found himself sitting across from Blackwater, 2 beers between them and the comfortable silence of professionals who had shared something beyond ordinary experience. "Chief," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. Before this mission I had doubts, not about your qualifications, those were obvious, but about whether you could handle the pressure when everything went wrong." Blackwater took a sip of her beer and studied his face with those dark eyes that had seen through the storm to find their salvation. "Commander," she replied, "doubt is healthy. It keeps you sharp. But it's what you do when the doubt is proven wrong that defines who you are." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, ranging from their shared experiences in combat to their different paths to military service. Rodriguez learned that Blackwater had grown up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where her grandfather had been a code talker in World War II, and her grandmother had taught her that the sky was not something to conquer but something to understand. She had enlisted in the Army as a mechanic, working on helicopters until she understood every rivet and wire, then applying for flight school when the military opened combat aviation to women. Her journey had been longer and harder than most, marked by obstacles that had nothing to do with her abilities and everything to do with others' preconceptions. "The thing about being underestimated," Blackwater said as the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, "is that it gives you an advantage. People see what they expect to see, not what's actually there. Last night, you needed someone who could fly in impossible conditions. You got someone who learned to fly by watching eagles, who understands that sometimes the instruments lie but the sky never does. Gender had nothing to do with it." Rodriguez nodded, recognizing the truth in her words and feeling ashamed of his initial doubts. The mission report that Rodriguez filed that morning was a masterpiece of military understatement. Chief Warrant Officer Blackwater demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment throughout the operation, successfully completing insertion and extraction under adverse weather conditions and executing an emergency auto-rotation following mechanical failure. Mission accomplished without friendly casualties. The dry language couldn't capture what had really happened, the artistry of her flying, the courage of her decisions, the way she had made the impossible look routine. But those who mattered would read between the lines and understand. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez received word that Blackwater had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the nation's highest award for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. The citation read, "For heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as pilot of a A-60 Black Hawk helicopter during combat operations against hostile forces." Chief Warrant Officer Blackwater's exceptional flying skills, sound judgment, and unwavering courage under extremely hazardous conditions were instrumental in the successful completion of a critical mission and the safe recovery of all personnel. It was well-deserved recognition, though Rodriguez suspected that Blackwater viewed it as simply doing her job. But the real measure of change came in the ready-room conversations, the informal discussions where reputations were made and broken. Word of the mission had spread through the special operations community with the speed of legend. Pilots talked about the auto-rotation landing in conditions that should have been impossible. SEALs discussed the precision insertion that had made their mission possible. Intelligence officers praised the successful capture of a high-value target. And at the center of all these stories was the quiet Lakota woman who had refused to let the mountain win. Rodriguez found himself defending Blackwater less and advocating for her more. When mission planners needed a pilot for high-risk insertions, her name came up first. When young aviators asked about advanced flight techniques, her methods became teaching examples. The transformation was subtle but profound. She had moved from being the female pilot who happened to be competent to being the exceptional pilot who happened to be female. The distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The last time Rodriguez saw Chief Warrant Officer Raven Blackwater was at the transfer ceremony when she left Afghanistan for a training assignment at Fort Rucker. She had completed 2 tours, logged over 600 combat flight hours, and earned the respect of every operator she had flown with. As she walked across the tarmac toward the transport aircraft that would take her home, Rodriguez noticed something that made him smile. A group of young pilots, both male and female, walking slightly behind her, asking questions about mountain flying and emergency procedures. She was no longer just breaking barriers. She was teaching others how to break them too. Years later, when Rodriguez had retired from active duty and was teaching tactics at the Naval War College, he would tell the story of that night in the Hindu Kush to each new class of officers. He would describe the storm, the engine failure, the impossible landing on a ridge line that existed only in the mind of a pilot who could read the sky like ancient scripture. But the real lesson wasn't about flying technique or emergency procedures. It was about the danger of assumptions, the cost of underestimation, and the way excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places. The SEAL team was misreading the map, he would tell his students, trying to find a landing zone that met our preconceptions of what was possible. Then her hand drew the ridge line not on paper, but in the air itself, showing us that sometimes the best solutions come from those who see the world differently. The story always ended the same way, with Rodriguez looking out at the faces of the future leaders of American military aviation. Chief Blackwater didn't just save our lives that night. She taught us that competence has no gender, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the person you least expect to succeed is exactly the person you need when failure isn't an option. The legacy of that mission extended far beyond the immediate participants. Blackwater's performance became a case study in advanced flight training. her techniques analyzed and incorporated into emergency procedure manuals. The successful integration of her unconventional methods with traditional military doctrine opened new possibilities for tactical aviation, particularly in mountainous terrain where conventional approaches often failed. But perhaps more importantly, her example inspired a generation of female aviators who saw in her story proof that excellence could overcome prejudice, that competence could silence doubt. Commander Rodriguez would eventually rise to the rank of admiral, overseeing special operations throughout the Pacific theater. But he never forgot the lesson learned on a windswept ridge in Afghanistan. That leadership sometimes meant recognizing when someone else had the skills you lacked, and that wisdom often came from unexpected sources. In his final efficiency report as an active duty officer, he wrote, "The best leaders are those who create environments where excellence can emerge from anywhere, who understand that the most valuable assets are often the most underestimated ones." Chief Warrant Officer Raven Blackwater retired from the military as a major, having transitioned to commissioned officer status, and served as a test pilot for advanced rotorcraft systems. She established a flight training school on the Pine Ridge Reservation, teaching Native American youth that the sky was not a limitation but a pathway to possibilities their ancestors could never have imagined. The school's motto, written in both English and Lakota, translated to, "The eagle does not ask permission to soar." Every graduate learned not just the mechanics of flight, but the deeper lesson that courage and competence could overcome any obstacle that prejudice might place in their path. The night in the Hindu Kush became more than just a successful mission. It became a parable about the cost of assumptions and the power of giving people the chance to prove themselves. In military academies and flight schools, in boardrooms and briefing rooms, the story served as a reminder that excellence often comes disguised as something society isn't prepared to recognize. The SEAL team had been misreading more than just the map. They had been misreading the person whose steady hands would guide them through the storm and safely home. And somewhere in the archives of military history, filed among thousands of after-action reports and mission summaries, the dry language of Rodriguez's official account stands as testimony to a night when the impossible became routine, when doubt transformed into respect, and when a Lakota woman's hands drew lines in the sky that redefined what it meant to fly into the darkness and emerge safely into the light.